Hey internets, a common rhetorical trick used to make a point about either metaethics, philosophy, or political ideology is to create a hypothetical scenario where one finds himself stranded on a desert island, with the purpose of this kind of hypothetical being to completely remove you from society. This type of hypothetical island scenario is usually specifically crafted to put people into a situation where they must choose between several, usually bad options, in an attempt to prove a point or concept about how the universe operates. And in this video I'm going to show you what kinds of points that these hypothetical island scenarios can prove, and what kind of points they really can't. Because there are honest ways that people use them, but there are also some really dishonest ways out there. And yes, this video will be getting into debunking the infamous Coconut Island analogy, because unfortunately a lot of these scenarios are used to push political nonsense, which is then regurgitated through the mainstream media in some way or another. Mass media in general tends to be extremely biased, which is why I am partnered with Ground News. Ground News helps you see past mainstream corporate journo spin jobs by compiling thousands of articles and reports on various topics, and then organizing them by context and political leaning, allowing you to see where the media bias lies. For example, there was a recent sting where the FBI raided the home of the CEO of Polymarket, that gambling website which predicted that Donald Trump would win the election. The feds then forced him to give up his phone and personal electronic devices, all for the victimless crime of failing to properly cross his T's and dot his I's with the CFTC's regulations. Ground News has many features that gives us a lot of information about this report that would normally take hours of research on your own. One, it gives us a bias distribution chart that lets us see at a glance which media sources are reporting this and where they lie in terms of political leanings. From this, we can see that for some reason, this particular story is being ignored by the far left. Two, it gives us a simple summary of the event, along with the total number of articles compiled, and which ones lean left, right, or to the center. Third, it provides the title and an additional quick summary of each source's articles, which allows you to quickly see how alternative sources can differ quite wildly on how they report the same event. There's also the blind spot feature, which breaks down media bias further by showing you which stories are being disproportionately over or underreported based on where the sources lean politically. And of course, there's many other features as well. Finally, Ground News is independent and subscriber funded, so to access the same features I have, you can go to ground.news/Mentiswave or scan my QR code I've been showing to now get 50% off the Vantage plan, which grants you unlimited access, up from the previous 40%, as a limited time offer. So let's start with a simple example. Let's say you find yourself stranded on a desert island. It's just you, your family, and one other person. Help will arrive in 3 months, but there's only enough resources on this island to provide food for you and your family. There's no way to acquire more. If you allow the other person to eat, you will all starve to death. This person will not try to kill you or harm your family directly, but he will stop at nothing to try and eat all the food. This odd man out is also such a glutton that he will eat so much of the food that there will not be enough for anybody but him if he gets his hands on it. So it's either you and your family or him. The point here is that the only way you and your loved ones are getting out of this alive is to at the very least string this guy up to a tree or something, ultimately letting him starve to death. Now, it's important to not try and take scenarios like this too literally, and to instead try to understand what they mean, which is that the scenario is designed to make you ask yourself if you would dispose of, to put it nicely, an otherwise innocent person if you were put into a situation where it was either you and your loved ones or them. It's a question of the human condition. It makes you take a look at the mirror and reflect upon yourself, and ask yourself, just how good of a person are you, really? Ask yourself what is good in a situation like this. The point is to think about your metaethics, the study of moral thought and ethical language to understand what is wrong and what is right. And in this case, the point is to give yourself some introspection on how well you think that you would honestly follow those rules. You can always try and find ways around doing that. For instance, a typical smart aleck take is the obvious "what about fishing?" question that always comes up in these island hypotheticals. But that would just be trying to ignore the point and avoid engaging with the philosophical advantage it's trying to grant you. It'd be kind of like those people who answer the question, if a tree falls in the woods and no one's around to hear it, does it make a sound? With the response of, well, yes, of course the tree makes a sound, because we know from empirical studies that objects crashing into each other create sound wave vibrations, which, while technically correct, ignores the philosophical point the question is trying to make, which is whether or not it matters. Back to the case of hypothetical islands, the point is to force people to come to terms with one of the most basic but hard to swallow truths about said human condition, which is that there will never be a perfect human utopian society because human beings are not perfect. No one is, not me, not you, and anyone claiming to be is either likely a scam artist or otherwise insane. Likewise, it also forces us to come to terms terms with the fact that the universe isn't perfect either. It doesn't automatically give everyone what they want or need, and for the most part, it's pretty chaotic and indifferent and comes with a seemingly infinite number of ways to kill us. And because of the imperfection of reality and human beings, there will always exist these hypothetical scenarios where these imperfections come to the surface, and we are forced to make a difficult choice, and reevaluate just what it means to be human. But on the flip side, what can't this kind of scenario prove? Where is our limit? In order to answer that, let's imagine that the person asking you this hypothetical scenario was not me. So whereas I have asked you this question simply as a way to get you to understand what these hypothetical islands are and to get you to think a little bit about ethics, let's instead imagine that someone bringing this hypothetical up to you was trying to prove that murder was a good thing for society. They present you with this island scenario and claim that if you would in fact string that guy up to a tree, then that means you agree with him that murder is a good thing for society, and therefore all laws regarding murder should be abolished. Yeah, no. This is where we have hit the limitations of what kinds of points that these hypothetical islands can prove. The problem here is that the hypothetical island is a closed system, whereas the universe itself, while still imperfect, is a lot more of an open system. So if someone were to try and take the hypothetical island I came up with and use it to try and prove that murder is a good thing for society, that wouldn't really work. What we would be seeing there is an example of false equivalence fallacy. You cannot directly take the imperfections of a closed system with severely limited options and claim it directly translates to an objective truth about a system without those limitations. You cannot equally apply the imperfections of reality and the human conditions to all situations equally. Or in oversimplified terms, just because a small raft boat cannot carry 10 tons of cargo doesn't mean that a large container shipment commercial freighter can't carry that weight as well. This failure to understand the difference is what tends to also result in an ignoratio elenchi fallacy, which is when an argument comes to a conclusion that is irrelevant as there is a mismatch in the point it is trying to make and the point it actually makes. In reality, the universe, while imperfect, is a lot less limited, and thus it is entirely possible for economic exchanges to be positive-sum exchanges. And where positive-sum is possible, not only do you not have to murder someone in the real world in order to feed your family, all ethics aside, in a free market world, it is actually in your best interest to not murder people, so that way they too can find a way to contribute to economic growth, which ironically makes it easier for you to put food on your table and a roof over your head. So taking the zero-sum nature of the island hypothetical I gave and trying to extract it to the positive-sum nature of the free market world just doesn't work. That's not the point it actually proves. The conclusion, if you try to draw it that way, becomes irrelevant. The correct conclusion, and what we should extract from this island, is not that murder is a good thing, but rather that society should focus on ensuring that we should strive to maintain a positive-sum economic system so that we never run into a situation where everyone is forced into us or them scenarios. Because what the island does prove is that murder, while wrong, can be tempting even if you strongly believe that murder is evil, which it is, if you find yourself in the precarious situation where you're strongly incentivized to do so, such as a situation where your family's life is on the line. Sadly, a lot of people do not seem to understand this. When it comes to a hypothetical island, you can really do anything. You can limit the resources and what happens here and what's allowed here in any way that you want. And you can also design it so that the NPCs in this island engage in any kind of irrational behavior that you can imagine. It's basically like designing a video game, kind of. And because of that, really anything is possible. This can be designed to put any political stance, ideology, philosophy, or ethical question in jeopardy simply by designing the imperfections of the island in such a way that a bad thing will happen to you unless you violate the political, ethical, or ideological position in some way. So for example, you find yourself on a hypothetical island. This island follows the rules of democracy. It's 4 cannibals along with you, and you're all about to vote on what's for dinner. Democracy destroyed! Or how about another? You find yourself on a hypothetical island. This island follows the rules of monarchy. The king is a prick and decrees that you must die, and the guards pop out and force you to eat all of the sand in the island until you explode. Monarchy destroyed! Or how about some ethical models? You find yourself stranded on a hypothetical island. On this island, the only way to get food is from this machine, which has 2 buttons to press. One of the buttons will provide you food until you are rescued, and the other button will somewhere else on the planet randomly fire a nuke at a random, heavily populated metropolitan area. The buttons are unlabeled, and so you don't know which one is right to press. Hit hard by this moral conundrum, you ultimately starve to death. And well, actually, haha, the starvation to death was all for nothing, because in reality, both buttons would have fed you, and I lied about the nuke. But you are not omniscient, so you didn't know that until watching this part of the video. Consequentialism destroyed! And just to show that the reverse point can also be made, you find yourself stranded on a hypothetical island. On this island, you have to sacrifice an innocent person, or else the island will open up and swallow you into the gates of hell, along with everybody else in existence. And this time I'm not lying, so being against consequentialism destroyed. Are we seeing a pattern here yet? You once again find yourself stranded on a hypothetical island. This island has been designed in such a way so that unless you do something that goes against something that you believe, the island will open up and swallow you into a pit of hell for which you will be damned for all eternity. humanity. Insert your ideology here destroyed. Yeah, it can get pretty dumb, to be honest. There is no belief out there that actually passes the hypothetical island test, because the islands can be designed to be as ridiculous, or the people within those islands can be designed to be as irrational as you can possibly imagine. So you can always make an island that is unfavorable to any given concept. And of course, I'm pretty sure that people who are not new to my channel can see where I'm going with this. One particularly infamous island scenario out there, designed by Voosh and often used by socialists, is of course the Coconut Island scenario. It goes something like this. You're traveling in an airplane and it crash lands, and then you find yourself waking up on a hypothetical deserted island. The only thing on this island that it has available to eat are coconuts. And while you were unconscious, some other guy also ended up on the island with you, and he woke up first, and he used his time to gather up all the coconuts on the island, build a little fence around them, thus homesteading the coconuts. And then you ask him, okay, well, can I have a coconut? And the coconut man says, sure, you can have a coconut, but only of course if you suck his D. Concept of voluntary exchanges being non-coercive destroyed. So yeah, the point people using this scenario are trying to make usually range from either capitalism bad to trying to claim that free trade and free transactions cannot possibly exist if there is a hierarchy or power imbalance between the people who are involved in that transaction. So in this case, a scenario is given where one person owns everything that is useful and the other person owns nothing. And thus the implication is made that the free market is actually coercive, and you would be morally in the right to steal from people if you are on the other end of that imbalance. The problem, of course, with this, again, stems from the lack of understanding that hypothetical islands allow you to create closed systems. If the Coconut Island were to actually happen, it's much more likely that the person who gathered the coconuts would be a bit more rational in what he's asking for, and instead say, oh hey, I see you've woken up, I've gathered all the coconuts for us, I'll share them with you if you agree to work with me here, and help me build some shelter, and maybe we can start a fire up, and work together so that the rescue team will notice us. And of course, translating to the real world, the way the free market actually works is, again, a positive-sum game. If you go to a store and you want an apple, you don't have to throat the cock of the store manager. No, they ask for money, and so you can find whatever job you're willing to do in order to get money and thus afford an apple. And that's why the Coconut Island analogy is actually just about monopolies. The point it proves is in fact true, that in a monopoly scenario where one person has all the power, that person can potentially abuse it. But that doesn't mean the free market is coercive, at least not any more coercive than anything else in reality. For example, say you were to find yourself stranded on a hypothetical island, and you find that you're alone on this island, and the only way to survive is by working to pick and farm berries. Is that work you have to do to survive a coercive effect? Well, not any more than anything else in reality, because again, we human beings are imperfect and we live in an imperfect universe. Our bodies have needs and we have to fulfill those needs, or else we die, and that sucks. So there's an additional reasoning mistake being made here in the Coconut Island analogy, where it's confusing one of the imperfections with reality for some kind of imperfection within something unique within the free market. Which is absurd, because when you stretch the definition of coercion this hard, then the word loses its negative connotations. You can make the argument that because the universe doesn't magically resolve scarcity for us as we desire, then the universe itself is coercive, at which point you're just making a mountain out of a molehill. And so the correct conclusion to draw from the Coconut Island analogy is that we should strive for a society that avoids monopolies as much as possible, and thus significantly reducing the effect of coercion here. And guess what? The Austrian economic system does that better than anything else. It is in fact a socialist society moving towards a communist society that ultimately gives the state a monopoly over everything, thus creating the biggest power imbalance you can possibly imagine. The harsh reality is you can't get rid of hierarchies because, again, the universe is imperfect. You can only strive for society that minimizes the negative effects as best as you possibly can. So while a free, voluntary society may not be perfect, in this regard, it's still the best you're going to get. The idea that it's possible in an extremely unlikely hypothetical scenario for a free exchange to feel coercive doesn't prove the point that Voosh thinks he was proving, which of course just goes back to his ideology that positive freedom should be placed above negative freedom, which, as I have already explained in previous videos, is a ridiculous idea that puts the cart before the horse and fails to understand how wealth is generated. And just to prove this, I will now construct another hypothetical island that shows the opposite. So let's say again, your plane crash lands and you find yourself stranded on a desert island, and you find yourself there with 7 other people. Now, unfortunately, none of the vegetation on this island is edible. However, strangely, there is a massive cargo unit filled with fresh expert-level fishing gear. Normally, fishing on a desert island is complicated, but with this stuff, you're good to go. It even includes a Fishing for Dummies manual, complete with a guide of all the fish that are available on the island to catch. However, it's still a lot of work. You find that, on average, it takes you 3 hours of fishing just to catch enough for yourself to eat for the day. But there's one little problem. The other 7 people are lazy jerks and don't want to work. When you ask them to help you fish, you find out that all 7 of them are members of the r/anti-work subreddit, and they provide various ridiculous arguments about how you're infringing upon their positive freedom to do whatever they want if you do not provide them with fish for free. So should you be required to work and fish around the clock just to feed everyone? And if you are to refuse to provide them with fish for free, is it an unfair act of coercion that you require them to get off their butts and work as well? Well, regardless of how you feel about that one, the point is that there are points you can make from hypothetical islands, and there are points that you really can't. And a lot of the invalid points actually boil down to a simple nirvana fallacy, where reality is being unfairly compared to utopia. Trying to use a hypothetical island to prove that all voluntary action is coercive is comparing reality to some kind of magical utopia where everybody is immortal, has perfect health, and thus the body has no needs, and you also get to just wish for whatever you want and it magically appears in your hand. It is a deeply unserious and intellectually dishonest argument to make, and honestly a little bit childish as well, because the overuse of the Coconut Island shows just how poorly many internet socialists understand how reality functions. They would rather whine about the existence of inequality rather than learning how inequality actually works, and how to mitigate its negative effects while propagating its positive effects. Yeah, that's right, inequality can actually be a good thing because it can incentivize people to strive for greater heights. But because a lot of internet socialists are so ingrained into this idea of whining about the fact that they don't get free stuff, that they end up clinging to these hypothetical island scenarios, thinking that it debunks the idea of voluntary action in capitalism, without realizing that these kind of scenarios really just point to the fact that we don't live in utopia, and that such island scenarios can therefore be designed to make any idea look silly. So when you come across a hypothetical island scenario, or you're designing one yourself in an attempt to prove a point, always remember that what truly matters from these scenarios is what can be honestly extracted and applied to the real world. And if the island scenario proves a problem, then you have to ask yourself, well then how do you best mitigate that problem in the real world? What you should not use hypothetical island scenarios for, and the main dishonesty that the Coconut Island analogy is guilty of, is you shouldn't use them to change a fundamental aspect of reality just because your beliefs contradict reality. Because what the Coconut Island really does is it just redesigns a world where wealth is zero-sum. So that way Voosh and other socialists can avoid the reality that wealth is not zero-sum. But most importantly, never let someone try to use a hypothetical island scenario against you in order to gaslight you into giving up your property rights. Especially when that gaslighting comes in the form of showing you that an extremely unlikely scenario in a system that is best designed to avoid that scenario can still potentially happen, and therefore the solution to the problem must somehow be abolished, which is obviously ridiculous. Anyways, that's all I have to say. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you really enjoy my content and want to support me, you can do so on Ko-Fi, Subscribestar, or by buying some merch, or again by checking out Ground News. That is all. Till next time.